Your voice, your opinion, your community. Fact TV, free speech protected.
Well, first off, thank you all for coming. Really appreciate everyone making the trek out in the weather. We will be having some opening remarks from former Senator Jay Kahn, and then myself and John will jump into the presentation. It lasts about 45 minutes, and then we are happy to answer any and all questions for as long as we can. And we really appreciate everyone being here. So without any further ado, I'll hand it over to Jay.
Thank you, and a big thanks to Joe Shapiro and Susan Hay for just getting us all here tonight. Thanks a lot. And this is a good crowd, folks. I hope this meets the expectation. The reason I am standing here right now is that over the last 6 years I served as state senator, and for at least one term I was able to chair the Education and Workforce Committee of the Senate, and during that term, those 2 years, I participated in creating a school funding commission and then serving as a leader of that effort. So I want to start by giving credit to those legislators who participated in this legislative session. It was one that, relative to education funding, I think everybody is claiming success. The governor is going to claim when he signs the budget bill that this is a success, that the Education Trust Fund is preserved, that it has a solid fund balance of some $250 million for some future use, and that the Democratic Party leaders, and we have Senator Fenton here tonight. Donovan, just wave your hand, who succeeded me in the Senate and is on the Education Committee and is continuing this work. The legislature and the Democrats did have a major impact on this budget, and starting in the House with the overall spending and trying to bring back disparity aid, and then in the Senate that was altered, but essentially the same funding amount, and actually another $20 million added on top. So the Republicans will claim victory because the means for adding money into this budget largely come from something called extraordinary need, a creation of the Republican-led legislature of 2 years ago, and expanded in this budget, and actually put on the path for greater expansion and use in future budgets, and that's what they'll claim as a victory for education funding. So everybody's going to claim that victory, and while all of this good intention is meaningful, it really misses the big picture here. The state will still only be funding 1/3 of the total public education expenses in the state. So when the state is putting forward $1.07 billion per year That's of a total public education expense in the state of around $3.5 billion. So about a third of that is being covered by the state, and the other third being covered by local property tax. And we know that the local property tax is not a fair funding source because of the varying levels of property valuations by communities. And so it leaves a community like Keene with an education tax rate that is at $12.40, and a community like Rye, which has Winnicott High School in it, in the school district, with a tax rate of $3.20. So you see the great disparity on the tax rate between communities, Keene being on the high end, Rye being on the low end, but with great variation across the state. What the Education School Funding Commission observed and statistically verified something that is just common sense. If you have the ability to raise more money, you will. And if you spend more money, your outcomes are going to be better. And that means that achieving equity requires some communities to have a tax rate that's up here, while other communities can outspend them per pupil by having a tax rate down here. And that equitable, I mean, it's hard to get equity. And in fact, the outcomes demonstrate it. Those that spend more have better outcomes. Those that don't spend as much don't. And it shows up in a variety of ways. And one of the most annoying things for me in the legislature was when public education got accused of one size fits all. Any school board member, any administrator, any teacher knows there is no one size in public education. And it's just an insult to say one size fits all, that's why we need alternatives to public education. But that's the way we fund public education, as if one size fits all. It's based on a 2008 formula. That formula is flawed in many ways. It's an accounting model, but the accounting is based on some flawed assumptions. It starts with that the average class size, the student to teacher ratio, is 25 or 30 students to one teacher. The statistics from the State Board of Education are that the statewide average is 12.8 students per teacher. There's not a school in the state that has a student to teacher ratio of 25 to 1. So that assumption doesn't work at all. And why? Because there's special education teachers, reading specialists, all sorts of teachers that go into the mix in addition to that classroom teacher. So, I mean, anyway, the second biggest cost assumption that's made in that formula is that it's based on an average teacher salary of a third-year teacher. That's about $44,000 in the state, when the average teacher salary in the state is around $66,000. So it's a flawed budget model in many, many ways, on the expense side and on the revenue side. It's also, one size does not fit all students. Some students require special education. Some students need English as a second language training. Some students decide to take AP courses with lower enrollment. Some students decide to take career and technical education courses. There is no one size fits all students. And that's where opportunities vary. And that's why a cost model really needs to be reformed. those opportunities vary because, I mean, the state's requirement are you have to offer 42 courses in a high school. But some schools offer much more. They'll offer AP courses. They'll offer college credit courses. And so the opportunities vary a great deal based on what you can spend in a school. So while the state has made improvements this year, and my kudos to those who fought in the trenches to make sure that that happened in this year's budget, there is still a long way to go to provide an equitable opportunity per student in the state of New Hampshire. And that's where the School Funding Fairness Project comes in. It begins to focus our attention on the job of funding educational opportunities and fairness, and that job is still incomplete. So with that as the background, I look forward to the remainder of the evening and the presentation by the School Fair Funding Project. Zach?
Thank you. Thank you. So my name is Zach Sheehan. I'm the Executive Director of the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project. Thank you for those opening remarks and to all the folks that helped make this happen. Just real quick, who we are. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization, statewide organization based out of Concord. We do, a large part of what we do is education about education and property taxes. One of the pieces being this presentation that you'll see here tonight. We travel all over the state. We're in Goffstown, Warner, Lisbon, Berlin in the past few weeks. We do online presentations as well. And then we do some work advocating at the state legislature, working with school boards and House reps and senators around legislation. So kind of the whole picture. And as an organization, we have some deep roots in the school funding work. And so I'll get kicked off. I'll introduce John Tobin, who's one of our board members. Will be co-presenting with me tonight. And John has been doing school funding work for centuries. So you get some good perspective from him, and we'll have him kick it off.
Got it. So thank you, Zach, and thank you, Senator Khan, for that introduction, which was both encouraging and also realistic about the ways we have to go. So this is a poster that came from Berlin, and these are Berlin students. And we start the program with the poster with kids because we just want to remind everybody, yes, we're going to talk about numbers and Constitution and things like that, but it's really, this is about kids and their future and are they being treated fairly. And I got into school funding. I was a young legal aid lawyer, and I was in Berlin, and I had some young kids, and I had a new house, and I heard about the Berlin City School budget annual hearing, and I went there all fired up to talk about they needed to spend what they needed to spend so that my kids would get a good education. And my eyes were open because some of my elderly neighbors were there, and they were saying, we really care about our schools. And at that time, Berlin had really strong schools, but they were also saying, we can't afford higher property taxes. And so that really opened my eyes to the box that our state puts people in, where young families with kids and older people on fixed incomes are pitted against each other. And now I'm one of the old people on a fixed income, and my kids are gone, and I see it from all perspectives. And this slide is to remind us that, yes, there are property taxpayers everywhere, particularly in Keene, who struggle with their property taxes in New Hampshire. And as we'll tell you, it's no accident. The property tax burden here in New Hampshire and in Keene is really a hardship. So the overview of what we're going to talk about is that neither students nor taxpayers are treated fairly. Our system does not treat students fairly or taxpayers fairly, and that's wrong. It also has bad implications for our future. The problem is getting worse. In the last 20 years, the problem has gotten worse, and you'll see a couple slides to show that the burden shifting to you as property taxpayers has gotten a lot bigger. And the current system is flatly unconstitutional. So this is our agenda for what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the role of property taxes. Then we're going to talk about the enormous gap between, and Senator Khan alluded to this, the enormous gap between what the state provides and what the actual costs are. And then about the consequences of this system for our economy, our kids. And then finally, current and future steps. So I'm going to talk briefly just to give you the constitutional background. And one of the things about this is that we are stuck with this phrase, constitutionally adequate, and what a mundane, minimalist phrase. We're going to talk in a minute about what it actually means. So the Supreme Court, there have been a number of court decisions explaining and basically revitalizing our Constitution. We've had a provision to cherish public schools since it was written, and a century ago and before that, the state was doing better. For the past century, it has not done well. So there are really two principles that we can boil this down to. The first is that it's the state's obligation to make sure that our kids get a constitutionally adequate education. And I'll talk in a minute about what the court meant by that. And it wasn't bland and it wasn't minimalist. And then the other thing is very simple, that whatever taxes our legislative leaders pick to fund that obligation, the tax rates have to be the same across the state. Those are the two principles. As we go forth, you can, you will see, I think, that we're not living up to either one of them. So what does adequate education mean? Notwithstanding the adjective adequate, the court, when it was talking about this, was expansive and future-oriented, not the reading, writing, and arithmetic of the 1940s or 50s, but instead, they were looking ahead to this century, and what they said, the core idea is, we need to give our kids what they need to succeed in a modern economy. The state economy, the local economy, the national economy, the international economy, because that's the world they live in now. And so it's not just reading, writing, and arithmetic. It's science, it's economics, it's technology, it's health. The range of things that our kids need to succeed. And we know they need those things. And so the court was well aware of that. And so the court made it clear that the legislature's obligation is to look to the future and be visionary about giving kids what they need to succeed. And the court was also really clear that whatever fits within that bucket of they need it to succeed is the state's obligation to pay for. And as we all know, our state is very skilled at delegating duties and financial responsibility. So the court wanted to be really clear. However the legislature may try to finesse this or delegate the responsibility, the fundamental obligation is on the state to pay for it. And the court said, quite rightly, that choosing revenue sources is a legislative function, it's not a court function. And they said very explicitly, the legislature has wide discretion in picking the revenue sources. And Zach's going to talk about this later. But if they decide to use the property tax to pay to meet the state's duty, the rate is supposed to be the same. And that comes from another provision in our Constitution that was put in there after the American Revolution to protect against oppressive taxation. That provision is really a provision about limited government so that the tax system doesn't get manipulated by powerful interests to shift the burden unfairly. So if the legislature loves property taxes, they need to make sure that the rate is the same to pay for this duty. And there's one other principle before I talk about the current lawsuits, and this goes back to something that Senator Khan said. The court also recognized that the needs are going to vary greatly from district to district. And they said explicitly, we're not talking about a cookie cutter formula where you give the same money in Colebrook as in Manchester. Manchester has lots of needs. It doesn't have the transportation needs, for instance, that Colebrook has. So the court recognized it's the state duty, but how that's spelled out is going to vary because we have a varied school districts. So we worked on the Claremont cases in the 90s and early 2000s. There was a modest bit of progress made, but since then, the state has really backslid, and that's a polite verb for it. And so after nothing happening, 2 lawsuits have been filed. One was filed in 2019 by the Conval School District, and that went up to the Supreme Court, and the court sent it back for a full trial. Then a number of other districts joined that case. That case is focused solely on the base adequacy grant. It's not addressing the tax issues. It's not addressing some of the other things that kids need to succeed that we've been talking about. Then the other case, which I'm more involved in, is called the Rand case, and that case also addresses the adequacy amount, but also central to our case is the question of tax rates. And the proposition of our case is very simple. Once you show that the state is not paying for all of the cost of adequacy, then it's pretty easy to show that the tax rates are unconstitutional because they vary so much to pay for that core duty. So the Conval case had a trial in April and May. The court is now probably in a couple of weeks will get through the criminal trial that judge is dealing with and start to work on that case. Then the same judge is hearing the Rand case at the end of September. So there will be some decisions from the Superior Court, certainly by the end of the year, hopefully before that. It's a certainty that when the state loses, they'll appeal. And so the cases are going to go along for a while more. But we are not, in these cases, trying to establish constitutional principles. We're trying to enforce them. So where are we? Let's see. We're going to talk about the gap between what the state pays and what it costs. And this is in some ways, this pie chart shows it all. The blue is property taxes. And you can see that local property taxes amount to 60% of the revenue for that $3.5 billion that Senator Kahn talked about, the total cost of public education. When you add in the statewide property tax, which looks like a separate entity on your tax bill, but it's collected locally, distributed locally, it's part of the property tax. When you add those two together, you can see that 70% of school funding in New Hampshire is property taxes. And what is the state chipping in? Well, the lottery's up there, 4%. Well advertised, but doesn't produce as much as one might think. Adequacy aid, other state aid, you can see that all of that adds up to a little more than 20%. If you give the state credit for the statewide property tax, it's about a third, as Senator Kahn said. There's a little bit of federal aid and there's other things, but the big, huge burden in our state for funding schools is property taxes. We're going to get to that. We are on the top of that list in terms of reliance on local property taxes. And here's a look at, and this gets back to our theme about how things have changed. In the decade from 2012 to last year, where did the increase in taxes come from? You can see that well over $500 million more came out of property taxpayers. The cost of schools went up, and local taxation increased rate to an overwhelming degree. State adequacy aid hardly changed at all. Federal funds were a part of it, but basically in the last decade, the burden has shifted ever the more toward local property taxpayers. And this is sort of a picture of the whole tax system. And often when you hear about tax debates in the legislature, you're hearing about the business enterprise tax and the business profits tax. and the interest and dividends tax. The big one is property taxes in terms of how taxation works in New Hampshire. This down here is more than $2 billion, that's local property taxes. Municipal and county is, you can see 1.6. The state part of the property tax has been set for years at $363 million. So you can see that more than $4 billion in New Hampshire are raised by property taxes. You put the two business taxes together, they get a lot of press, but look at the comparison in the burden. And for whatever reason, we've been cutting those for whatever reason. And another one that we're cutting doesn't even make this chart because it's small, the interest and dividends tax over there, which is doesn't raise a ton of money, and the legislature has decided to phase it out. So that's sort of a bar graph way of saying we are incredibly reliant on property taxes here. And in some ways, we are a low tax state, but we have all our money in one piece of the portfolio, property taxes. So I'm going to turn it over to Zach.
All right. So while we are a low tax state in some ways, and a lot of the things that we'll be kind of running through, and you'll see this theme throughout the presentation, is who pays is kind of the central piece that we're trying to get at, because that is not equitable or even around the state. And so what this is showing is income brackets, lowest on the left, highest on the right, and total tax burden, so percent of your income. And basically we have a perfectly regressive tax structure here in New Hampshire. So the less money you make on average, the higher percentage of your income goes to taxes. And as you can see, the driving force, this dark blue line, dark blue part of the bar graph on every single income bracket, is property taxes. And so folks making $45,000 to $72,000 a year are paying about 6%, over 6% of their income to property taxes, while people making over $520,000 a year are paying less than 2% of their income to property taxes. So in general, and we'll get into kind of how this happens, why this is, in general, the more wealth you have, the more income you have, the smaller percentage of your income is going to taxes. And the property taxes is the largest driver behind that regressivity. This gets to the question that was raised a little bit earlier. I understand some of these are all very small numbers for some folks. What this is a map of the United States with property tax revenue as a share of the total state and local revenue per state. And so New Hampshire, we rely the most on property taxes than any other state in the country, about 64%. Massachusetts is 36, Vermont's 44, Connecticut is 39, Rhode Island's 43%, we're 64. So we rely extremely heavily on local property taxes to fund not just schools, but also a lot of our municipal services. While on the other hand, the amount of money the state is kicking in for our public education system is the smallest as a share of total school revenue in the country. So we rely the highest on local property taxes, and the state kicks in the smallest amount. And this 30% is giving them credit, the state credit for the statewide education property tax, which is a local tax. It's raised, retained, and kept locally. But even with giving them credit for that, we're still the lowest in the country at 31%. Massachusetts is 42%, Connecticut's a little closer at 37%, Rhode Island at 40%. So the state kicks in the smallest share, relied the most heavily on local property taxes. And this wouldn't, in theory, be a serious issue if property values and the ability to raise money via property taxes kind of followed students around the state, right? If where there were the most students, there was also the most property value, then relying on property taxes might not be a huge problem. But that's not how anything works or how demographics work. And one way to kind of dig into that issue a little bit more is this concept called equalized value per pupil. And what this is looking at how much taxable property, so property that can have a property tax levied against it to raise money, is kind of behind each student to tax for public education. So think of it like, what's the size of the bank account, the size of the pot of money behind each student in a community on average that can be taxed to raise money for the schools. And so a kind of basic example of that is two communities, let's say Keene and Jaffrey, both have an expense of $10,000. And say it's an expense that they're ordering something from Amazon for the schools. You know, Amazon doesn't care what school district you're ordering from, how big it is, where you're located, the size of your budget. A box of Chromebooks is going to be $10,000 regardless. So in community A, let's say that's Keene, if you have an equalized property value of $1 million, you have a tax rate of $10 per thousand, you've got your $10,000 for your Chromebooks. But say over in Jaffrey, their property value is only $400,000. If they have the same tax rate at $10 per thousand, they only raise $4,000. So to raise the amount of money needed to buy that same product, they have to have a tax rate 2.5 times higher to raise the same amount of money. And this is not just a hypothetical. I'll read out some of these, and also everyone that signed up on the sheet, we send out this slide deck to everyone afterwards. It's on our website, but I'll pull out a few of these examples. So we'll just use some at the top here. Portsmouth and Milford have similar student populations, about 2,100 students. Portsmouth has an equalized value per pupil, so again, that amount of taxable property kind of behind each student able to be taxed to raise money for schools, so of almost $4 million. So with their tax rate of $5.50, that's both the local education and the SWEPT, and this is just simple math straight across, they're able to raise about over $15,500 per student. Milford, on the other hand, similar student population, but their property value is only $1 million, as opposed to Portsmouth, almost $4 million. So they have a tax rate of $14 per thousand, 3 times higher than Portsmouth in Milford. And with that tax rate 3 times higher than Portsmouth, they raise $15,000 instead of $21.5. So significantly higher tax rate, raising significantly less money per student. And here's a same information for some of the communities around here. So we can compare, we were just talking about Milford, but Keene, for example, equalized value per pupil just under $1 million, so significantly lower than the statewide average. And I will just pause here to kind of forecast a little bit later in the presentation. This is just one metric by which we can measure communities' ability to raise money, their fiscal capacity. It's actually a metric that is tied to some funding that was debated in the legislative session. It's not destiny, it's not fate. So it doesn't mean that if you have a low property value community, you therefore have bad schools, you therefore have bad outcomes, right? It's just as a metric of a community's ability to raise that money and how hard you have to work to raise a similar amount of money. So for example, if we compare Keene to Portsmouth, it's going to be similar to that comparison to Milford. Keene has a equalized school tax rate, so it's both the local and the SWEPT, about $14 per thousand. Gives you the ability to raise about $14,000 per student. Compared to Portsmouth, they can have a tax rate a third of that and be raising $21,000 per student. So significantly lower tax rate, raising a lot more per student. And what that does is it lessens the pressure. The pressure John was talking about in his experience in Berlin, where there's less of a dynamic where every single dollar you're adding onto the property tax bill is hurting people harder and harder because they're already paying $15 per thousand just for their schools. Whereas in Portsmouth, maybe that's a lower amount, and so adding another 50 cents or another dollar is a less contentious piece, and they're going to raise a lot more for it for their schools. This is the same information just displayed visually, because I know that sometimes it's easy to see that. And something interesting is, and we talk a lot about how this system is deeply inequitable and kind of affects every part of the state. We don't have to go hunting around to find examples of how this doesn't work for either a school district here, or a community here, or a property taxpayer here. So what this is one dot, it's actually not a line, it's a dot for every single town in New Hampshire, their equalized value per pupil. Again, this measure of kind of how able are you to raise money for your schools based on the property value in community. And 75% of all the students in the state live in towns with below average property values. So by definition, live in towns where raising that tax rate is a little bit harder because people are already paying slightly higher amounts. You're getting slightly less dollars for your schools out of that slightly higher tax rate. It's hard to find anything else where it impacts 75% of the communities in New Hampshire. And this includes some of our biggest cities, some of our smallest towns. It includes communities that only vote Democrat, that only elect Republicans. It includes communities that go back and forth each year, that have split tickets. And the point of this being that there's a kind of endless coalition of people that are impacted by this issue and would benefit from changing it. So a little example to kind of get out of property tax rate world is just dollars out of your pocket. So how much money are people paying just for their education piece of their property tax bill, which is not the only piece, in homes that are in different communities? And so we just did this little project, looked at Zillow 2 years ago and just pulled out property listings from all over the state. And what you'll see here is the house on the left in Bridgewater is valued at about $300,000. The house on the right in Jaffrey is valued about $115,000. The house in Jaffrey paid more for their local education property tax rate than the house in Bridgewater, even though it was 1/3 the value. That's just their education property tax rate. And that's because Jaffrey has a significantly higher property tax rate, so the bill that they're paying is much higher. And so what you see here is, this is one metric by which we can see that it's fair to assume, on average, that the individual or families living in the house in Bridgewater have a little more wealth, might have a higher income, have the ability to pay a little bit more, and yet they're actually paying less than the family living in the house in Jaffrey, even though their house is worth 3 times as much. I think we're swapping now. All right.
So I'm next going to talk about the state aid and what it does and what it doesn't do. But I just want to reemphasize something that Zach said. In 3/4 of the school districts by where the kids are, taxpayers in New Hampshire have to run faster. They have to sweat more. They have to pay more to support their schools. And in New Hampshire, that's what property owners do. We pay high property taxes because we believe in schools. And I think of that, frankly, as heroic. We care about our schools enough to pay really high rates and really different rates in different places because we care about schools. So now let's talk about what the state does and doesn't do. Wrong way. The state money is called adequacy aid. And these numbers are going to change a little bit as a result of the new budget, but incrementally, not fundamentally. The base adequacy is going to go up a little bit. These 3 are going to go up. This one's going to get eliminated. So, but basically the bottom line is going to be about the same, maybe a little bit more, that the state's providing maybe $5,000 per year on average in total aid per student. And so let's talk about where that goes, and I keep doing that. This is a little bar graph that shows how that works in some communities around here. The green is what's actually being spent. And these days the average cost per kid around the state is something in the neighborhood of $20,000. And it depends a little bit about whether you include debt service on the buildings or transportation or things like that. But that's roughly the number. And you can see in the blue what the state is pitching in toward that cost. It's not very much. We did a study, we did an experiment with the town of Allenstown to figure out, well, if the state says that you can pay for an adequate education with the money they're giving you, and you're spending a lot more, what do you need to cut in order to get down to making that make sense, having this, what the state provides be the whole bill. So Allenstown, about 500 students, they were getting a little less than 5,000 per kid from the state, or 2.4 million, you can see. Their actual budget was over 12 million, and they were spending about 24,000. They are a poor district, a small, poor district. So the exercise was to cut things so that you would get that budget down to what the state says is all you need. So the business manager and one of the folks involved in our project just sat down with their spreadsheet, their 500-item budget spreadsheet, and said, all right, let's start cutting things so we can get the expense level down to what the state says enough. So they eliminated all buses. You know, kids have to get to school on their own. All support for English language learners, all special ed service, contracted services, all out-of-district placements, all supplies, copier machines, no plumbing and heating repairs, no new textbooks, no art, no music, no PE, no Chromebooks, no co-curricular sports field trips, 2 secretaries gone, 3 of the 4 custodians. That's just the first page. And more. No support for the school board, no summer programs, no art, no teacher, no physical ed teacher, no substitute salaries. So if the teacher's sick, there's nothing. The kids go home. No guidance counselors, no crossing guards. And they just kept cutting until, and here's another list. You can see, you know, all the things they're cutting. No health insurance for the teachers. All these things. And then, how far did that take them? It didn't take them all the way. So then they decided the next thing you have to do is cut all the tuition for their high school students. They don't have a high school. Their local schools are K through 8. So we can't get down to that number unless we eliminate spending anything on high school kids. So if we're going to follow the state's adequacy numbers, education stops at the 8th grade in Allenstown. And even with that, they still, and when they were doing this, they were trying to save teacher positions, thinking that's the core expenditure. Even after they did all of that, they still had to cut nearly half of the remaining teachers. So you can see what the teacher-student ratios would be. And again, schools would stop in the 8th grade. How can anyone say that the amount of money the state provides could possibly pay for an adequate education? It just can't. So there's some consequences to this crazy system of huge tax burdens and lack of state aid. And there are a lot of different ways to look at these consequences. There are a lot of different ways to measure them. And you can see the effects. One way to look at it is looking at teacher salaries. And compare this chart compares the starting salary for a teacher with a bachelor's degree and the starting salary for a teacher with a master's degree. And you can see in Manchester what those salaries are. And then jump down to Portsmouth. So the first year, that teacher in Portsmouth is being paid more than $8,000 more. And so what happens is that teachers get hired at the poorer districts for lower salaries, and then they move, they migrate. And I had a superintendent in a small rural district analogize it to minor leagues and major leagues in baseball. He said, we're Pawtucket, or now the Worcester Sox, and we bring them in, we train them, and then understandably they go down the road and get $15,000 or $20,000 more. And it's not like they're getting $500,000 with stock options, but they're getting a salary that's more easy to live on. So that's one of the consequences. And if you go to a student, if you go to a school district that has high teacher turnover and you talk to the students about it, it's very demoralizing. Teachers come and go. In some districts like Franklin and Pittsfield, sometimes they lose a third of their teachers every year. And it's a consequence of this system. And those taxpayers in those places are paying really, they are sacrificing, but there's a limit because the system, they don't have the resources to raise the money to compete. So here's another interesting chart, another way to look at the arbitrariness of this. This is 4 towns in the Timber Lane School District. And just think about a kid from Atkinson and a kid from Sandown, the 2 girls, and they're sophomores in high school, and they take pretty much the same classes and sit next to each other. They're getting the same education. But the parents in Atkinson, because it's a more property wealthy town, are paying a whole lot less than the parents of the kid in Sandown for the same education. And that's just, again, it's a function of property wealth within those 200-year-old municipal boundaries. So the other thing we'd just like to touch on briefly is the economic consequences. And in doing that, I kind of want to go back to fundamental public policy. I think everybody would agree, conservative, liberal, Democrat, Republican, that we would like our state government, through all its policies, to foster a level playing field. We don't want to favor one section of the state or one set of communities over the others, that whatever those policies are, they should be even-handed. But the biggest piece of our revenue-raising system is not even-handed. And the consequences are, for places like Berlin, is it's very hard to bring in new businesses because, as people up there have said, why would a rational businesswoman or businessman open a business in Berlin where the taxes are a lot higher, the school system is not as well supported, so whoever comes to work there is going to worry about schools for their kids. So this system really plays favorites. And there are a lot of old mill towns that a century ago were very prosperous, and a lot of small communities that are stagnating. We know they're stagnating. And it's in part because we have a system that really discourages economic development in those places. And again, people in a lot of those places are heroic and creative in figuring out ways to bring that development nonetheless. But it's a system that even discourages affordable housing because people who are thinking about that in their town are thinking about, well, if we have more housing, we'll have more kids, our school costs will go up, and it'll be on us because the state isn't going to chip in. So there are lots of school officials that have told me quietly or openly in the last 40 years, we don't want more kids, we don't want more families. And how crazy is that we have public policy that discourages families? But that's a consequence. So here's some metrics about Keene. And as you look at these, you can see that in terms of a number of these things, Keene's doing about average as compared to the state, and doing better than others. But I would go back to the property tax figures that Zach showed you. Keene's equalized value is about 40% less than the state average. So your tax rate is 40% more. So you are sacrificing, you are paying in more and sacrificing more because you care about education so that you can do what you need to do to give your kids a shot. And it's paying off. Your kids are doing okay, but you are sacrificing a lot to do that.
All right, so this is the last section here, and then we'll open it up for any questions folks might have. Just want to touch on a few things that have been talked about more recently, and then as recently as last Thursday. So just to kind of like set the stage for some of the solutions that we've been looking at and then looking forward to next session and the following years, coming back to like, why is this a problem? What's the big picture? And the underlying piece of this is that 70% of our revenue for our schools comes from local property taxes. And hopefully by this point we've kind of explained why that's inequitable, unfair, unhelpful in a lot of different ways. And so to put kind of a finer point on it, it's about $2.3 billion per year that we as local property taxpayers are currently paying into our public education system. And so depending on how you read the Claremont decisions in the Constitution, the entirety of that should be the state's responsibility, or at least a significantly higher portion. And so kind of the short answer, if you will, is that the state should take responsibility for all of that. Now, $2.3 billion is a lot of money, especially in the size of our state budget. But that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be more of a recognition of how much is being downshifted onto us and how much the state should be shouldering responsibility instead. Senator Khan mentioned at the beginning the Commission of State School funding that he worked on, and kind of two pieces from that to really highlight here. And this was a commission that was done in 2020. They spent a full year and hundreds of hours of testimony and research and contracted with a national firm that does this type of statistical analysis all over the country. And after all this work, the kind of punchline was, yeah, the current system's inequitable for both students and taxpayers. People pay more who have lower property taxes, and people pay less who have relatively higher wealth. And to be crystal clear, there is a relationship, a negative relationship, between the district's outcome and their poverty levels. A lot of times we get questions around like, does money matter, basically? You guys talk a lot about not enough funding or where the funding is coming from. There is measurable impacts on the amount of money students have, specifically when students have access, who need additional resources, have those resources, and are able to keep up with their peers. So this is the state budget, for those of you who don't know, was passed on Thursday in a surprisingly quick end to the session, where the Senate made their changes, and then the House effectively said, looks good to us. And now it's heading to the governor's desk, and he will be signing it shortly. So there's a few kind of changes. So these are the pieces that John went over earlier. So kind of like the base adequacy is every student in the state gets this amount, and they add on a few of these individual elements. And so the one on the left here is what would be happening this next year if nothing had changed. And then we have the governor's proposal, the House, and the one that was passed just last week. And so there is a significant increase in the total amount of spending that the state is dedicating towards public education. You can see there's kind of some changes where the governor proposed a bunch more per student, the House dropped it down, and the Senate went somewhere in the middle. The free and reduced lunch, which is a measure of, in general, a measure of students coming from households that are experiencing poverty, got increased across the line, and again, kind of a compromise here in between the governor and the House. And this is one of these kind of tricky areas because depending on who you ask, this is the picture. We increased it across the board. We increased funding across the board in all these elements. They did eliminate the third grade reading. What this was is students who were not deemed proficient in reading at the third grade as a marker of kind of a point at which you can intervene with the most success for the rest of their school career. It's a smaller amount of money in general, and basically everyone throughout the process agreed to eliminate that. Now, a bit more of kind of getting into the finer pieces of it. So in general, that targeted aid was increased by about $30 million. And that was done, as mentioned earlier, by the Extraordinary Needs Grants. And so these really focus on a combination of property value, again, taking into account the community's ability to raise money, and in general, how many students there are experiencing poverty. However, in both the governor's proposal and pieces of the House and the Senate version that was passed by both chambers, they eliminated what's called stabilization grants. And so these are grants that, in general, it's about $157 million a year, in general go to communities with lower property values and higher concentrations of students with need. It's a lot of money. It's pegged on data that's about 12 or 13 years old, so the argument was made that since that's old data, we shouldn't be giving money out based on communities that had lower property values a decade ago. The problem is not many communities that were struggling 10 years ago are kind of doing great now, right? Like some changes, but not a lot. And so by eliminating that, it kind of created some communities getting a drop off, and the other aids that were increased did not make up for this aid that was eliminated. And so they created this thing called hold harmless grants. And I know this is getting a little bit in the weeds, but it will relate to kind of where do we go from here. And so this hold harmless grant, the idea is we made all these changes, and the budget will take effect July 1 of this year. And some communities, because we increased here, decreased here, some communities might see less than they would have if we didn't change anything. So all those communities, we're going to make sure you don't lose any money for the next 2 years during this budget, which is good. Some of the proposals did not take that into account, right? That is good. The problem is, by pegging more money to the per student basis and removing some of this other funding that took into account students with higher levels of need and relative property values, is that once these hold harmless grants, in 2 years, they start phasing out, right? And so then in 10 years, or in 3 years actually, some communities will start losing money. And in general, the communities that will start losing that funding are in general rural communities and in general communities with higher proportion of students need and lower property values that don't have the volume of students to kind of make up that gap. And that, we don't think that that is the right way to do that, but that is an approach that is taken. And the consequences here are kind of compounded by reducing revenues to the state. And so one piece I'll highlight is that the interest and dividends tax that John touched on earlier is a tax on if you have money that is earning dividends, so basically sitting there earning revenue for you, income for you, you have to earn a certain amount of that income, and then once you hit a threshold, then that income is taxed. So this is not your normal paycheck, right? And the interest and dividends tax raises about $135 million a year. Over half of that comes from this tiny percentage of filers that earn more than $200,000 a year in income based on this wealth that is effectively hanging out, generating income for them. So these are, in general, entities, mostly people that have an extreme amount of wealth, and this is a revenue source that the decision was made throughout the budget process this year to eliminate that. While on the other hand saying we can't afford those stabilization grants because they're pegged on data from 10 years ago, so we're going to eliminate those. And I draw that comparison. I'm oversimplifying it. The budget process is extremely challenging, a lot of moving parts. But my point in all this is that decisions at the state level have dramatic consequences, both short-term and long-term for communities. And when people don't connect the revenue to the school spending, to the property taxes, it's easy to see these as kind of like isolated policy decisions when they really do all impact each other. And so just a few ideas for how we could generate some additional revenue. I just mentioned the interest and dividends tax. We could go stop decreasing our business taxes. Whoops. There's additional wealth taxation ideas, some of which has been proposed by some legislators here in the room about interest on the tax on capital gains or financial transactions. I'm going to spend a little bit on the property tax, since that's a tax that we are familiar with and comfortable with, and in general, policy is easier to make when you're kind of changing something that already exists as opposed to introducing something new. So if we were to go to a true statewide property tax, so in theory, eliminates your local education property tax, and the state is raising the amount of money we're currently spending on public education with one tax rate, so everyone pays the same tax rate around the state, be about $10 per thousand. So in theory, in Keene, you'd go from about $14 to $10. Now, some communities would pay more, some communities would pay less. This is incredibly oversimplified. It would not be that easy. But just to give you kind of an idea of what would that tax rate look like to pay for what we are already spending. To drop it down a piece and to connect it to the Conval lawsuit that John mentioned at the top of the presentation, they're effectively saying we think that every student in the state should get about $10,000 instead of the $3,800. That's the kind of like narrow argument of their lawsuit. To pay for that would be a true statewide property tax of $4.50. And so these are not astronomical numbers to pay for a lot of what we are already spending. And then something else that others...
Is it worth pointing out that that statewide property tax, when it was enacted, was set at $6.60?
Yes.
Today it's at $1.44 in the coming budget. Because the total amount from the statewide property tax has been fixed at
Yeah.
$130 million for a long time. Anyway, I just wanted to give you some context there. It's not too far in the distant past.
Yeah.
450 would have been a discount from where policy began.
Yeah, so just to reiterate, in case people couldn't hear, when the statewide education property tax was initially introduced in 1999, it was $6.60. So, and it's going to be $1.50 in the coming year, $1.44. And so the $4.50 per thousand is actually less than it was at one point. Obviously, property values have gone up, which is part of that piece. But it's a good piece of context that this is really within the realm of things we've already had in the past. And two other taxes that in New Hampshire often people don't like to talk about, but they are taxes that do exist and other states do use them. And so just to give a little context, again, to kind of like put in perspective the amount of money that's raised. And both of these taxes have pros, both have cons, both politically, administratively, who would pay. Neither of them are a silver bullet as any taxes. But just a little bit of context, and this is from fiscal year 20, so a few years. Vermont, for example, raised $400 million in their sales tax and about $760 million in their income tax. Maine raised $1.6 billion in their sales and $1.8 in their income. So there's a little bit of context for, you know, we have an identity as a state of kind of people coming here and or coming here to buy things, move here, do business here because of our relative taxes compared to our direct neighbors. And just context for, we could look at some taxes like this and still be way below our neighbors and raise significant funds. Again, the politics around it, the administration around it, far from simple, but pretending they don't exist is also not helpful. So, high-level summary, and then we're happy to kind of answer any questions that folks might have. This issue around school funding is deeply connected from both taxpayers and students. It's regressive, and there's negative correlations between both. State is downshifting about $2.3 billion per year. It's money we're currently spending on our public education system, largely through through local property taxes. Problem continues to get worse. And some of the changes that were just passed in the budget do help in some ways, absolutely. But they are not hitting the root cause, they're not a lot of money, and 2 years after this budget, when the hold harmless grants start to kind of phase out, some communities might be left worse off. Current system is unconstitutional, as evidenced by the Constitution and the Supreme Court rulings, but also the current lawsuits that are really picking apart a lot of these different pieces. And lastly, the solution does lie with state-level policymakers. So this is not a school board can fix this, a planning board, you know, and school boards and planning boards and state councils do the best they can, largely in the system they're in, but the amount of money flowing, the taxes used, is really a state-level policy issue. And so kind of a final piece here, and then I'm going to hand it over to one of our amazing organizers, Susan, is that in New Hampshire, where you live does have a dramatic impact on both your taxes, the amount of money available for your schools, and something as arbitrary as your zip code, we don't think should have such an impact on such important things. So thank you so much for being here, really appreciate it. I'm going to give it to Susan for a few words.
Really good job. Hi, folks. I know this has been an incredibly informative and not short meeting, so I'm only going to take a couple of minutes. I want to talk, John mentioned that in New Hampshire we are heroic because despite the cost and the unevenness of it, we're paying for our schools and our schools are good. That is slated to change. very quickly, and I want to talk about that. How many people here, show of hands, know what the 306s are? Okay. So you can see that's not many people. That's not many of us. We all care enough that we're here at this meeting. We came in the rain, but we don't really know what they are. Those are the minimum standards that change what is the cycle? Who knows what the cycle is? Every 10 years. Okay, and that is happening right now. It is a process that has not been transparent, there is nobody, I don't know, are you on that committee yet, Bill? Okay, there are no current educators on that committee. The information from, there have been so-called listening sessions around the state where people have been furious because A, they are not listening sessions, they're talking sessions, and B, their input is being ignored. I want to give you a couple of examples. So, yes, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now? Okay, thank you. If the draft that has gone in to the State Department of Education through the process that, sorry? No, sorry. Okay. Through the process that they have initiated is passed, we do not need art, PE, or music teachers in our elementary schools. They are not saying we can't have them, but it is not a minimum standard for us to have them. And it's really interesting because they don't come out and say that. What they do is they show a side-by-side comparison of what the standards have been. And then, oh, what a surprise, they're gone. No one is saying we have to have those anymore. You know what else we don't have to have in elementary schools? We don't have to have librarians or libraries in our elementary schools. And that is such a degradation of our school systems and the education that our children will get. There is much more. There is a lot of damage to the funding around facilities. You know, ventilation, having to stay on top of ventilation, it disappeared. You know, equity, diversity, equity, and inclusion, all that language is completely removed from the document. And I mean, I could honestly talk to you guys for another hour about this. You would hate me if I did it. I'm just saying that the only thing that is going to change this is if people like us just say, absolutely not, this will not happen on our watch. In the last cycle, when when the education department said, you know, we don't think our high schools need foreign languages and many other things. One of the things that changed that and put a stop to it was parents and educators and just people who value education in our communities. You know, maybe your kids are up and grown, but you still know how important it is. Business leaders just said no and kind of raised their voices up so well that, whoa, the legislature said, okay, we're not doing that. And that wasn't the only reason, but it was a significant part of why that stopped. So I'm here asking you today, this is going on, this is on rails. If we're gonna stop it, we have to focus on it now. I know it's summertime, but I'm asking anybody who is interested in doing this, so there's some groups that are working really hard on this, to join us. And the way you can do that is you can come up and talk to me, and that would be great. Or you can sign in there, over there, and you can just put a star by your name, and I will call you, okay? Because we just can't let this happen on our watch. All right, so that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. So we're happy to, you know, I don't want to hold anyone hostage, so if you need to leave, by all means, but we're happy to answer questions to the best of our ability about things we had up on the slides, things we didn't, pieces you think we missed. Happy to kind of dig into that for a few minutes if folks have any burning questions.
Statement. I came from California about 5 years ago, but I grew up in New England, in Massachusetts. And in California, I was paying $3,200 a year in property tax for a house that's very equal to what I purchased here. Actually, I had to pay $50,000 more for this year. So what I was paying in income tax in California is about equal to what my property tax is. So when you're talking about what other people are paying for income tax and maybe getting that, we're already paying for it in the high property tax. And for people that are 65, which I am, I mean, I might have to go out and get another job if you bump it up $10,000. So that's something that, you know, the older people really need to look at, because our property tax is high, and I don't live in Keene. I couldn't even afford to live in.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'm glad you brought that up. So something so for folks who couldn't hear, and let me summarize, and if I don't get it, let me know. Basically, you know, people, who have fixed incomes or who are no longer working, who the property tax is the largest tax you're paying, if we increase that at all, for example, in a statewide property tax, that could be a significant hardship for folks. And that is an argument that is very fair, and is also used as to why, for example, we get that a lot for like Portsmouth. Portsmouth says, it's not that we don't want to pay more as a community, it's that we have people in Portsmouth who can't afford it. Just because on average we happen to have higher property values and higher wealth doesn't mean everyone who lives in Portsmouth is wealthy, which is very fair. And so two pieces to think of with that. One is that we don't have to have the statewide education property tax, for example, could be a tax that just comes from the state directly to individuals, and we could dramatically increase the amount of property tax relief for it, for example. We have a program right now there's a low and moderate income property tax relief program designed specifically to help if you can't afford your property taxes. They paid out $1 million in relief last year. Remember, we paid $4 billion in property taxes. And so the threshold for that is tiny. The average amount people get is like $400. So part of addressing that concern is, why don't we dramatically increase the threshold for that and put more money into that, so that people who can't afford their property taxes, if there is fluctuation, can get some relief. Other ways to do that would have some sort of exemption on the first, say, $200,000 of your house, so you don't pay property taxes on that. And so that kind of takes into account people that maybe have a house that's worth $3.8 million, that $200,000 is not going to be a big deal. But if your house is worth $400,000, that exemption would be a significant help. And so those are things that when we're talking about like advocating for solutions, those are exactly the elements that we want to make sure are included, and why we kind of like harp so much on the interest and dividends tax, for example, where people who are benefiting from that in general have significantly more wealth. So I hope that helped answer, yeah.
With property taxes there, they had a proposition where the property can only increase in value 1% per year. So people that have been in their house and that are older are not going to have to move out because of property taxes. Yeah. Whereas here already, they bumped up the value $60,000 in a year. Yeah. That's ridiculous.
Yeah. Yeah, and when you rely so heavily on property taxes to fund your schools, your municipal services, local communities feel like they have to do that sometimes. So it's kind of like that tension again. Yeah.
If the plaintiffs prevail in the two suits, do you have enough of a crystal ball to say, okay, and the court's going to order some relief? Does that then just kind of kick the can down the road for the legislature again?
That's a great question. Ultimately, the legislature has to make the final decisions. But, we are talking about how we can compel the legislature to do that and not go through this again, where the court says, here are the principles and here's what you have to do, and the legislature ignores it. So in other states, and this is getting ahead of the game, I don't want to declare victory when we're just about to have a trial, but we think the principles are clear, the facts are pretty clear. In other states, officials have been held in contempt. They've been fined. In other states, schools have been shut down. We don't think shutting down the schools is a good thing, but maybe that's the way you get the legislature's attention. So how that transpires, we don't know, and we're still thinking about. But yes, we have to find some ways to get the legislature to do its job. Ultimately, and courts are reluctant to jump across that barrier and take over for the legislature. So it probably needs to be something where the court isn't picking a tax. They shouldn't pick a tax or pick a number, but some consequences to the legislature if they don't. And so that's very much on our minds. We don't want to have happen what happened last time, where basically the legislature, and I have to say, and governors of both parties ignored this and got away with it. Why did they get away with it? Because they didn't hear enough from us. We sort of naively trusted, oh, the court said this is unconstitutional, they'll follow their oaths and fix it. So we all really have to put the heat on. And our experience has been, both before the pandemic and after, if we actually start to raise this issue, the legislature does pay attention, because it's not obscure. Everybody knows about property taxes, and it's been simmering for a generation. And so we all need to get out our best civics muscles and just keep asking our legislators, when are you going to fix it? How are you going to fix it? What bills are you going to introduce? What are you going to do about this?
And one more piece I'll add on to that is that now that the session's almost over, something you can ask your legislators, some of whom are in the room, are you going to file bills to help fix this? If so, what do those look like? And we as an organization, part of what we do is try to help people get that information. Any party, any rep, any senator. And so, if I'm paid to do this. I might care about it, but I'm paid to do this. So the reps in the room, yeah, they might listen to me a little bit, but they're going to listen a lot more to what you have to say. And so if you say, hey, I'd really like you to address this, or I didn't know about that interest in dividends thing, how can we fix that? That will help push that conversation, and we're there as a resource as well. Yes.
Well, no, it was just any relationship with what she said about, we moved from upstate New York 9 months ago, and it was a shock to the Texas here. And we moved from an 1,800 square foot house to the 1,073 square foot condo. And it just kind of blew our mind. Now, we're all for education and paying for education, but I'm hearing this from other people in the situation from the senior center that it's really tough.
Yeah, and not to put him on the spot, but the gentleman sitting behind you is Representative Ames, and he's put in bills in the past that would put specific increases to the amount of property tax relief folks could get depending on your income and looking at how much money you're making or not. And those don't always go very far because they're kind of controversial. But bills like that are being put in, and we want to help support them. And so thank you for bringing that up.
I live in Winchester, and so this is very much resonating for me and a lot of our community members. So one thought is I'd love to have you come into a presentation there, because we talk a lot about property taxes, and I don't think folks really have an understanding of the depth of what you shared tonight in terms of school funding. The second thing I wanted to ask or throw out there is I'm curious, because one of the things we also talk about in my town, because we have a challenge with our kids at Keene High, graduation rates, et cetera, and their opportunities are limited because we're a sending community. If there's any research or messaging about what happens for students once they leave public high school and their ability to succeed at a 4-year, a 2-year, and technical school because of the fact that they're not getting an adequate education and being set up to prepare themselves for when they leave and go into somebody's higher college situation. So another way to think about how we message this.
Yeah, that's a great point. And something we've looked at recently was for example, the number of AP classes that each high school offers, just as one of those metrics, or how many students from each high school apply to and get into UNH, right? And the post-secondary enrollment. And there are some of those metrics, some of them are perfect, but they definitely do paint a picture where, in general, there's going to be, I remember one of the folks that talked to us in Berlin was about, not having access to chemistry classes in high school. It's that limits your ability to what major you can go into. And not everyone goes on to college after, but access to career and technical centers. So yeah, it's a little tougher to draw down the specifics, but a lot of the work the commission did and others did show that those access access to or not in public schools did have those ramifications later on.
I have a comment and a question. So I live in Gilson, a small town, about 800 people just working here. Glad to hear there's somebody here from Winchester. If you all have an interest in doing this presentation and inviting those of us who live in small towns, I'm a member of the planning board in Gilson, so I would be happy to promote this presentation in small towns where a lot of the information that you're presenting is particularly profound. Right? So that's the comment. And the question is, have you all done any work on the impact of the Education Freedom Act on budget and educational funding?
Yeah, so the Education Freedom Accounts, otherwise known as vouchers, was passed a few years ago. For anyone that doesn't know what that is, it's basically you can apply for and get funding directly to a parent to pay for things like private school, homeschool expenses. It's about $5,000 a year, and it does come out of the Education Trust Fund, so it's public dollars. So there's a number of issues people can take with it. I think that kind of twofold. One is that it is not a lot of money in the grand scheme. It's way more than originally projected, but it's not a lot of money in the kind of scheme of the billions of dollars of the education system we operate in. But it's pulling money out of a system that is really cash strapped and relying really heavily on property taxes. And so, as an organization, we tread lightly around this issue, in part because it is funding related. There's elements to that. It's also very controversial in a lot of other ways. I think just to kind of point out a kind of dichotomy is that, that is a blank check. There's no limit on the amount of money that the school voucher program can use, as explicitly written and defended. And yet, with the school funding system, there's very specific amounts. We're only going to increase by $1,000 here, by $100 here. And so that dichotomy is challenging to see sometimes. So, sorry, that's yeah.
A couple other points about that. One is that in contrast to all the rules that public schools have to follow in terms of making sure that their teachers are trained and all that kind of stuff, there's no accountability about how that money is being spent. The other thing is people have looked at, well, who's using that? And by and large, it didn't pull tons and tons of kids out of public school. What it did, it gave state money to families who had already made the decision to send their kids to private school, which is a decision they can make. But it's state resources basically going to families that had already decided to not use the public education system. So, and it's small money compared to the other things the state's not doing, but you can see that fixing this could be a whole lot of different patches of small money to get to the bottom line.
Well, so I wanted to thank Tom for bringing that up, because I was going to bring that up too, and I don't need to tiptoe around it. I'm a state rep from here in Keene, and it is a small amount of money, but if we look at the growth of the Education Freedom Accounts, it was originally $300,000. It is now almost $25 million. The governor and the Department of Education wants $60 million for it. There's no accountability. We pay a private firm 10%, I think it is, so about $2.5 million a year just to manage that fund, right? And as you pointed out, 80% of the students enrolled never went to public school in the first place. And we saw bills this session that would increase eligibility to 351 bill, 500% of federal poverty level, right? I'm a professor at Keene State. When my two older kids were at home, when I first made full professor, I would have qualified under some of the expansion that is now in that bill. It was originally intended for students in the neediest parts of the state, the neediest families. Now it's up to 350% of the poverty rate. Families up to about $100,000 a year. There was another effort to put that up to 500%, right? So even though it is a relatively small amount, And if you look at where that money is going, I had a constituent send me an email the other day and ask me why we're sending money through EFAs to Liberty University. It's one place that we send money among lots of different places, many of which begin with Saint, and I say that as a Catholic myself. So it isn't a huge part, it isn't a huge piece now, but if we look at the rate it's growing, we look at the commitment that some people in the state have clearly made to pushing that further and further. It's only going to keep growing. It's benefiting people it was never intended to benefit in the first place. It's going to schools that don't have to provide services that our public schools have to provide. So I'm glad Tom brought it up, and it is one piece of the puzzle, but it's a critically important piece because it is exploding.
And I just want to add to that, I live in West Chesterfield, and at my school board meeting this year, one of the things I learned was that if a student from Chesterfield decides to go to, say, Lionheart Academy in Peterborough, that money leaves my school budget. If that student comes back to Chesterfield because they don't like Lionheart Academy, no money comes back to them. So that's the part I'm interested in seeing included in your presentation, is that those school funding consequences are very big, because now all of a sudden, if I've lost 10 children from Chesterfield, I've lost $40,000 or whatever that works out to be, and I'm not getting that money back, and that's going to have to be made up for by something.
I just want to, my name's Joe Shapiro, and I'm a state rep as well. And I just want to piggyback on what John said before about, I would love it if the courts somehow not only ruled in favor of fair funding, but also required fair funding. But that hasn't happened in the past. I don't necessarily expect that it'll happen in the future. And I think that the solution, really, if there is a solution, is that people vote on this issue, speak up on this issue, refuse to have it go the way it has been going. And I think, unfortunately, we've seen the way things have actually gotten worse, and part of the issue is that people are numb to this issue. Everyone knows that it's a problem, but only thanks to you guys do people really understand how it really works. And it's been going on for so long that I think the expectations for change are unfortunately low. There's a lot of talk in the legislature about, healthcare is a human right, or the right to defend yourself is a God-given right. People talk about what rights people have, but the reality is that it's us who make the decisions. And it's the citizens, by voting and by demanding of the representatives what's a right and what isn't a right. And so, I'm very encouraged by the number of people here, and great presentation, and we need more.
One thing, I was involved a little bit in the Croydon situation a year ago, and that was really interesting, and I learned a lot from that, and I've also been traveling around doing these presentations a lot, pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. And I guess I would say that what I've seen is public schools are really important to most communities in New Hampshire, and most people really understand that when they're pushed to think about it. I think we all take them for granted a little bit, but in fact they are central. The buildings are central, and they're just really central to our communities and our connections with each other. And I think the support for public education is broad and deep. I think that people who have been attacking it are noisy and sometimes articulate. They're very well funded, but I think they're a small minority. So what I hope to have happen is that the broad support for public education, which has been sort of latent and quiet, will rise up in part in response to the attacks on the the regulations and on part the freedom accounts and the stunts like Croydon, where they were going to just get rid of their school system essentially. So I guess I think that support for public education is deeply woven into our communities. We've taken it for granted a little bit, but we just need to be better citizens about it. We need to be more active citizens. And my sense about the New Hampshire legislature is people in the legislature do listen. I mean, you tell me, my sense is if you get 10 calls on an issue, you're paying attention. And so we just need to do our job to make sure that you're getting the polite civic heat that you need to do to make sure that you do your job.
Thank you for this tonight. Trying to follow it. I'll start with just a couple of comments. One, I highly support EFAs. I love what we're doing, that we are taking $4,000 to help fund a lower income child to give them options that they don't get, that a wealthy family might have. And for someone who, I'm from Chesterfield too, and for that, say 10 students at $4,000 apiece, that $40,000 that you're not getting, you're also not having to raise the other $150,000 locally to contribute to that full $22,000 or whatever it is. So you're saving $150,000 and losing $40,000. So that's how the EFAs actually work. But I'm a little befuddled by your quest of even tax rates. Like you mentioned, a teacher that in Portsmouth is making $10,000 more than someone else. But what you didn't mention is that person in Portsmouth is having to spend a whole lot more for her house or her living expenses living in Portsmouth versus somewhere else. And the same thing, concerned about the rates. A $300,000, say 2,000 square foot house here in Keene is going to cost you at least double that in Portsmouth. And the same cost of living for them in this 2,000 square foot house. So if their tax rate is half, they're still paying the same amount of taxes as someone else here. You know, if their rate is 5% and it's 10% here, just for easiness, they're still going to be paying that same amount for the same house, even though, and they had to pay $300,000 more for it. So I'm just a little befuddled by what is equal, what is equity. Equal rates do not mean the same thing for everyone to experience that rate equal.
Yeah, I think the kind of the here versus Portsmouth is, cost of living is a piece of that. I hear what you're saying. Part of to really draw the kind of absurdity of our current system, and I'm spacing on the name of the town. If you can come off the top of your head with it, but we just did something recently where we looked at two towns right next to each other, not on the seacoast. Both sent their kids to the same high school, house 1 mile apart. One house was paying 3 times the taxes of the other house. Same cost of living, same exact everything, just happened to be an arbitrary town line in between them. And because of that, right, because one town, then part of it had a little lakefront, really high property values, probably second homes, could keep their tax rates really low. And so that's that kind of, just because of that town line, mile down the road, going to the same school system, that's where you can kind of really see that play out more. Yes, I understand in Portsmouth there might be different costs of living, but that's kind of when you rely so heavily on property taxes, you get the absurdity of that system where people are paying very different rates.
Well, just to take it to rates, I know you mentioned, why are we cutting business taxes now? Our revenues after cutting rates are actually higher than ever. And so we actually are getting more revenue by a lower rate.
But the revenue is so small compared to the...
Well, it doesn't matter. The revenues have increased with a lower rate because of growth and what it encourages. So I'm just a little befuddled. They're not always...
Yeah. Let's go back to your example about Portsmouth, because I think it's important to talk about that. you can't live in Portsmouth or Rye unless you can pay the price of admission, which is to buy expensive property. So you don't get in there unless you have the money to buy that property. And then forevermore, you have that really valuable asset. And so it might be the same size in some ways as a house in Keene, but the value of it is dramatically different. And when at the end of your time in Portsmouth or Keene, you go to sell it, it's not the same house. You get a whole lot more. You had the money to pay for the price of admission, and once you pay that, you get lower tax rates and really wonderful school system. And when you're done, you get a really valuable asset. And
That doesn't matter after you die.
As someone who has moved all over the country, I can tell you that that is not always easy when you feel like a family of 5 or whatever, you need to try to get something for 1,500 or 2,000 square feet. It hurts if you're having to double what you just left.
of course, but there are so many people. There's so many people who can't even get in that game. They can't even get in that game, and
A teacher earning $50,000 is not going to, with our different up on the Portsmouth, might work there. They're not going to live there. We're not going to live there.
And, you know,
Yeah, and I think part of this is also, we're not, part of what we're trying to show is who's actually paying. And I think people, just that there are policy decisions that result in kind of direct impact on how much people are paying. And there are always going to be examples to prove everything we just said wrong, to prove everything, you can kind of pull all those pieces out. But in general, if you look at the reliance on property taxes like we have, it does create these heavy reliances. Like, school boards have nowhere else to raise money. That is the choice. It is raising your property taxes or funding our schools, largely, right? And that is coming from the state not providing those funding. And so yes, there's going to be examples around that, but when you start to look at kind of, again, back to the absurdity of the town lines dictating so much of the tax rates on your property values, part of what we're trying to get at is it doesn't have to be that way. It hasn't always been that way, and we can think of different approaches. Maybe we can. Yeah, you haven't asked a question yet.
It's saying that when a child receives vouchers, that the school district saves money when those children leave. Could you explain why that's not true?
I think sometimes, one of the examples is that, in a classroom where there's 20 students, if 3 leave, you can't reduce your costs relative to, you don't then not have to pay a third of it, or an 18th of a teacher, right? And so I think even if you have 3 students leave a classroom, you're still going to be paying for that teacher in that classroom. The lights still need to be on for the same amount of time. A lot of the costs associated with running the school don't decrease proportionately to the number of students leaving. And I think something interesting, so I guess that's kind of like why that is not always a one-to-one. And, in general, a lot of the kind of rhetoric around the school voucher program is kind of to provide choices for students who are not finding what they need in public schools. And yet 80% of the funding has gone to students who were not in public schools. And so I think that's part of the, and this is also why this is a challenging topic, but I think, so maybe we'll wrap up here, but I want to kind of say one piece in all of this relative to civic engagement, which was why it's so important for, I don't have all the answers. I don't think anyone individually in this room has all the answers, but kind of having this give and take, what do you think, where does this hurt, where would this help, is kind of like how we craft solutions. There was a bill last year that would have doubled the amount of base adequacy aid. So that per student basis, everyone gets it, and then you add on all the differential aid. Vouchers, the definition and the funding of vouchers is tied to what base adequacy is. So by doubling base adequacy aid, it would have dramatically increased the amount of money that the state was responsible for, in theory, reducing all of our property taxes, right? It would also double the amount that vouchers get. I was the only person that testified on that bill. period. And it's my job to, right? And we said basically some parts are good, some parts, I didn't even comment on the vouchers because it was just, I think that this would help for public schools this way, maybe not this way, but my point being that bill just got introduced and then died immediately. But there was no discussion on it. There was no, I think it would have helped here. I don't think it would have helped here. What if we tweaked it this way, right? And so part of that, like, being engaged is hard if you're working full-time. It's hard if you're a rep and it's your job to be there. It's hard to manage that. It's a lot of time. But just my point in all that being that we don't have the single solution either. And so kind of like working on these pieces and figuring out what works without damaging, educational opportunities for anyone. So I'll give you the last word and then we'll wrap up.
Another thing I want folks to understand with EFA vouchers, as Nick mentioned, the income threshold. I mean, you can be making 6 figures in your household. So that means if my child is in a public school, right, and I'm doing my fair share and paying property tax, et cetera, then I'll pick on you. You suddenly wake up one morning and say, you know what, I want my child to go to this charter school or somewhere else. There's no accountability, there's no, do you really, you can't take care of this on your own? Oh yeah, I know what, that's what the EFA voucher said. We're creating this huge gap where it doesn't matter. I'm gonna be very loose with my words, so just bear with me. It doesn't matter if you've got a financial need. To me, my opinion is if there's a child that truly the district has tried, the family has tried, and it's not working out for that child, and they need to go to another school, and they do not have the financial resources, my personal take, that is okay. But we have now got this whole loosey-goosey voucher system. And then to the woman who was saying, hey, if we have 4 less students, we're in a cost savings, that is absolutely false. Because as you mentioned earlier, we still have to pay for the building, pay for transportation, staffing, all of the costs. Those don't go away. Here's another big gotcha that I want folks to understand. If her child needs special ed, speech pathology, any of those, for lack of a better word, extras, guess who's paying for it? The district. So it's not a savings. Depending upon that child, we're actually now in the red because we're not getting revenue for her child, but we're still paying extra to provide and deliver those extra services. So it's very important that folks are crystal clear. It's not a one-for-one savings. It's not one less head count is suddenly like, woohoo, it's a big savings. It's absolutely not. We are on a cliff and it is dropping fast.
So I said you could have the last word, but I lied. I'm going to wrap it up here, which is that, and this is my kind of facilitator, this is my job to kind of like pull this together, is what I've heard every single person say, and at least part of what they've said is, I want the kids I'm thinking of in my head to have access to the education and services they need, right? Whether you think that's through public schools or through a private school or through a religious school or homeschooling or vouchers or not, right? That's what people are coming from. I want kids to have access to that educational opportunity, and I don't want to be paying an insane amount for it, right? And so those are goals we can all be working towards and having these debates about the best way to do that. But I think highlighting, and again, I'll bring it back to kind of like our big piece, highlighting how little the state is helping with that in general and also compared to the rest of the country is important because it puts these conversations in this box where the reason we get so heated about small amounts of money is because we're putting a lot of tax dollars into that money. And so, we're all kind of like moving in that same direction, hopefully, but these are complicated issues. I appreciate people sticking around. Yeah, thank you for being here.